Okay. First of all, do we have any native Chicagoans here? Or is everybody, what? That's not true.
Almost native.
You're from
Michael,
Nebraska.
I'm not a native, but I went to Loyola, so I lived there for 3 years.
Ah, okay.
I lived there 14 years, okay? Does that make me a native?
14?
14.
Well, kind of. More than Omaha, I guess.
Yes. No, not even.
Or just as much. Yofi. So today we're going to focus a little bit about Chicago and the man who drained the swamp, to use that famous term now tossed around a lot in American politics. Let's move on to our presentation. First of all, I want to thank Shmuel Cohen for taking over at Leave Note. Mayor Potiel is leaving Leave Note in a couple of days after 18 faithful years at Leave Note, helping out in every way possible. And I want to just publicly say thank you to Mayor for all his help, and always smiling and never getting mad, which is infuriating, actually. And I'm sure Shmuel will do a great job. So welcome, Shmuel.
Thank you very much,
Mayor. So here we have a picture of Chicago for those who are familiar with it, and a picture of the swamp down below, the Hula Swamp and Lake. So let's take a look. Here is the Hula Valley. Let's go back to a time when there was no Hula Valley. There was a time when this valley, which you can see here circled in red, did not exist. If there had been humans on the earth at the time, you could have walked from the Galilee to the Golan, which wouldn't really have any difference between them, with no valley between them. It would just be a plateau. But at some point during the creation of the world, two huge plates started splitting apart. The plate on the left, which we would like to call the Israel plate, but some would call it the African plate, some call it the Sinai plate. And the plate on the Golan side, which is usually called the Arabian plate, started moving. Now, at first, what happened, according to most researchers, was there was one huge basin that was formed at this fault line, and one huge lake that stretched the entire length of what is today Israel. Later, though, thanks to the direction and the rate of the splitting of the plates, three different basins were formed into which water continued to flow, and you can see them here. You have at the bottom the Dead Sea, in the middle the Sea of Galilee, and a little bit north of that, the Hula Valley, where there used to be a lake. And that, incredibly simplistically, is how Israel today is the home of the Dead Sea, Lake Kinneret, and the Hula Valley. As you can see, if you want to go from the Galil to the Golan, you got to go down and then back up, vice versa the other way. So something happened which was a game changer. Tectonic movements, which is movements underneath the earth, formed a long ridge on the southern side of the valley where I'm moving the arrow here. And that ridge was made even higher by volcanic activity that affected the area, especially on the eastern side or the Golan side of the valley. Some of the big lava flows on the Golan Heights spilled down into the valley below, as you can see. And there were also some small volcanoes that formed inside the valley itself. You can see them right where the Machanaim Junction is today. And this ridge stretched from, you can see the River Jordan going through it, so it kind of stretches from the Golan and the Gesher Benot Yaakov Bridge all the way over to the left to Rosh Pina and Chatzor. The valley was now blocked, as you can see, and water was not able to get through easily. The drainage had almost come to a halt. In essence, the valley was now a bathtub, as you can see. In the north, we have Mount Hermon and the hills leading up to it. In the east, we have the Golan Heights. In the west, we have the mountains of the Galilee. And in the south, we have this ridge, which is called in Hebrew the bolt. As it were, it locks the drainage of the entire Hula Valley. This doesn't exist in south of the Kinneret, and of course, it doesn't exist in the Dead Sea because that's the lowest place in the earth, but it does exist there. And so what happened was there was a lake that began to be formed there. Here is a look, by the way, from the bolt. The photographer here, which is not me, is standing on that ridge near, in this case, Mishmar Yarden, Kibbutz Gadot, looking down to the valley, which used to be, of course, a lake, and you can see more to the north, Mount Hermon. Here again, this is the bolt looking towards the Golan Heights, and you can see in the background the lower area of the valley, which used to be a lake. So in a way, it was kind of like an accordion, because in the southern part of the valley, which today is all farmland, there was an actual lake, which you can see on the right. And above it, to the north, was swampland. But it wasn't always swampland. If it was winter and there were plentiful rains, the lake became bigger and the swamp went more north. If it was summer or there were less rains, the lake receded towards the south and the swampland receded also towards the south. Here's a look from almost the same area near Nebi Yusha. We're looking south, and on the left, you can see what it was like in winter, where you have in the south, you've got that lake, and there was a lot of rain, so you can see the swampland is flooded. And the picture on the right, the lake is still there, a little bit smaller, and there's still, you can see a little bit of swampland, but not much. That's already a picture from the summer. So it moved back and forth, and it never really stayed the same. You never really knew what was going to happen during that year. It goes according to the rainfall. So without going too much into detail, just very cursory, because I don't really want to talk about too much about geomorphology or about even the history of the draining of the swamp, because that's a whole different subject. I wanted to specifically talk about the man from Chicago, but just to understand what was going on in a few sentences. The wetlands of the Hula Valley here, you can see pictures of those wetlands before it was drained. It was a paradise for flora and fauna, for fishermen, especially at Kibbutz Hulata, but also other fishermen who were in the area, the Arab fishermen, Jewish fishermen, who cast their nets in this lake. The Awarna nomads made a living out of herding water buffalo and of taking the papyrus and the cane, or what we usually call reeds, and making mats out of them or tents out of them. And you can see how those girls, I don't see any of them smiling for the camera there. It looks like they're in incredible pain, but because that's heavy stuff. But this was a way for them not only to build their homes, but also a way for them to make a living by selling it. And the question is why, if all these good things are happening, why drain it? So officially, we can talk about, we'll just mention 6 reasons, which are well known. The most obvious one being, of course, malaria, which is still a problem in the world today, but in most of the Western world, it's less of a problem. It's caused by this mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito, which was in the Hula Valley. So in order to eradicate that, they wanted to drain the swamp. They wanted more farmland. This all used to be underwater. So you can see it did not only farmland, but also villages. They wanted to use the water more efficiently. There were springs that flowed underground, and they wanted to be able to use those for drinking water, for agriculture, for industry. Peat which is always underneath swamps, is they thought would be a great way to make some money because it's used for fertilizer and in gardens and also for energy. In some countries, they actually burn it in order to keep a house warm. That didn't pan out, to put it lightly, but they thought it would be. The other was a plan to use the water going down in the Jordan towards the Kinneret to generate energy. Also never happened, at least at this spot. And lastly, they wanted to make roads because when it was wet, it was impossible to travel, which since it was all wetlands, who would want to travel there anyway? Well, we did have an international border there. On the other side of the lake was the border with Syria, who was constantly shooting down and causing trouble. And therefore, although it wasn't a major reason, definitely the army wanted to be able to move easily there without getting stuck constantly in the mud. So there was a bigger reason, of course. And the bigger reason was in the early 50s, this was the Zionist thing to do. Once the War of Independence was over, notwithstanding the influx of immigrants, draining the Hula became the first major project of the new state of Israel. In fact, the entire Jewish world joined forces to help make this project happen. The JNF, Karen Kayemet, and the Israeli government both presented the drainage project as the flagship project of the young state and the Zionist enterprise. This was a project that demanded action and the rolling up of sleeves and conquering the wilderness. And as part of this conquest, malaria prevention was most often presented as the top priority, even though we know that by that time, malaria wasn't really a threat in the 1950s. But the concept of conquering the wilderness was still relevant, turning useless, as it were, swampland into farmland, feeding the poor immigrant masses coming from all over the world, supplying jobs to the unemployed was a national consensus. And even the few scientists and nature lovers who wanted to keep a small part of the wetlands were not against the actual draining of the area. They just wanted to change it a little. The project was popular also for other reasons, such as very positive media coverage, fairs that they had, maps that they put out, movies that were made, and even inclusion of JNF material on the importance of draining the swamp in the national school curriculum. It's hard today to describe the excitement that was felt all over the country. I only read about it and listen to people who lived through it, but thousands of visitors and tourists came to watch. There's Eleanor Roosevelt on the left, just one picture. It was considered watching history, a watershed moment. That's not a joke. The organizers actually had to deal with so many crowds that the workers could barely do their jobs, and they had to actually have a certain number. Once that number was full, no more visitors could come in. And international dignitaries came. Everybody came to the north to see with their own eyes history being made. So the first stage was actually deepening the Jordan River, which you can see here at the southern edge of the valley. That took, by the way, 2 entire years just to do that. And that was because they didn't know how tough the basalt rocks actually was. And there was another problem, which is the constant shelling of the bulldozers and the workers by the Syrian army's mortar fire. Here you can see that there are tractors and bulldozers right next to soldiers who are looking up towards the Golan Heights, trying to see if something bad is about to happen, and it usually did. There weren't a lot of casualties, there were some, but it was enough that often work couldn't be done for a while. And after 2 years was over, it was time actually to start draining, and we're talking about the year 1953. So the next stage now is to dig underwater canals and remove the huge amounts of papyrus and reeds that were growing everywhere. Now, how is a bulldozer supposed to do that without sinking into the water and the mud? There was one man who had the key to unlock this mystery. And his name is Jacob Raphael Sensibar from Chicago, Illinois. His story has yet to be told. And as far as I know, this is one of the first times it's being told. Thanks to his family, both in the United States and in Israel, various news items, things picked up on the internet, and a few chroniclers, we can now piece together some of Jacob's story, the story of a man who helped Israel with all his heart, all his soul, and all his might. And yes, as you can see, he loved cigars. So Jacob Raphael Sensibar was born in Russia in 1890, and his parents made Aliyah to Israel a few years later. Unfortunately, there was a tragedy. All of Jacob's brothers and sisters that were born in Israel died of various diseases. I don't know which. I wanted to know if it was malaria. I haven't found out what. But his mother had enough, and she said, "We are moving the family to the United States." They moved to the United States, and 2 more children were born there, and they indeed did survive. The parents settled on farmland in a place called Jasper, Indiana. But after crop failure and flooding wiped out their farm, which is the same thing that happened to my grandparents when they moved from Germany to Missouri, they didn't know how to deal with all the natural events that are constantly going on in the United States. The family moved to Gary, Indiana in 1907. And it was in Gary that Father Mendel Sensibar founded a company known as the Sensibar Sand Company. At the time, Jacob was actually part of the staff, and he was a junior in high school at the time. So they got a contract to level an area of the Indiana sand dunes, not far from the Lake Michigan, of course, which then became the site of the huge United States Steel Company, which used to be the biggest steel factory in the world. For the next few years, the company sold sand from a huge sand pit for building projects in nearby Chicago. Gary's close to Chicago. So at first, the sand was transported by horse and wagon. But then there was a fire, not the Great Fire, that was earlier. There was a Great Fire of Chicago, but another fire wiped out the entire barn and their equipment. So then they started transporting sand by train from Indiana to Chicago. However, 70% of their profits, 70 cents on every dollar, went to paying workers to load the trains by hand. By the way, to load the trains and then to unload. So JR, as Jacob became known, wanted to come up with a more cost-efficient method. Perhaps transportation could be done by water. So JR visited other earth-moving sites in the country, and he saw that some boats could pump up sand from the bottom of a lake and bring it to shore to unload it. But while this sand sucking and loading was a quick process, the unloading often took days. Using his internal and natural engineering wisdom, and through trial and error, JR came up with a novel way to unload sand as quickly as it was loaded. He simply reversed the pump that loaded the sand with water and used it to unload the sand with water, which is still done today. Using this method known as making sand soup, JR's solution was a huge breakthrough. It was officially patented, and it was called the Sensibar sand fill method. And it was just one of a number of patents that JR had registered. After sand sucking from a lake or a swamp, the reverse pump could load a sand soup mixture of about 15% sand and 85% water. And after unloading, of course, the water ran off, and the dry sand formed a relatively flat and solid base, which was perfect for the construction of large buildings. In 1916, the Sensibar Sand Company got a big breakthrough. It entered a bid for filling the area in Chicago where the new Field Museum of Natural History was to be built. And their bid was 30% cheaper than the next bid. And the area that they had to fill was 15 feet underwater. JR won the contract. And when the project was finished, the site stood 40 feet above the lake level, which is incredible. We're talking about 1916. This is close to 60 feet of water that has been overcome by huge amounts of sand. The Field Museum stands there still today and impressively overlooks the Chicago Lakeshore, adjacent, for those who are familiar, to the Adler Planetarium, the Shedd Aquarium, and of course, for the Bears fans, Soldiers Field. The company went on to fill most of the Chicago shoreline, and the name of the company was later changed to Construction Materials Corporation, which apparently was a little fancier than the Sensibar Sand Company. The company went on to do many national and international projects, and this included, over the years, this is just a partial list, changing a 20 million ton sand dune into a 6-mile beach in Los Angeles, scraping out 12 million tons of Coney Island ocean bottom and using it as a filler for the New Jersey Turnpike, participation in building the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland and the Tappan Zee Bridge, the old one, in New York, participation in building the LaGuardia and Newark airports in New York City, and a huge project in Ontario, Canada, where it removed earth that was covering rich ore, and more earth was dug up there than was dug up when digging the Panama Canal. There are a number of patents registered in JR's name that deal with sand sucking, underwater concrete pouring, which Hera did in Caesarea, but we won't compare now, and operating a hydraulic dredge in sub-Arctic winters. So thanks to many projects such as these, J.R. Sensibar became known as, believe it or not, it was actually called this, the world's greatest earth mover. Jacob's brother Ezra, who was born in the United States, as we said before, graduated with a degree, of course, in engineering from Purdue University, and he joined the firm, and they all relocated to Chicago. And the company then became known as the aggregate company instead of the sand company. The sand soup method, though, was receiving international attention, and they became a huge corporation. Father Mendel, who started the whole idea, went back to Israel to visit some of his relatives. While he was there, he heard that the British were interested in building a port in Haifa. He offered to help with his company, but they said it wouldn't be proper. They wanted to be fair, and it wouldn't be proper to give this work to a Jewish person. And so he dropped the idea. Soon after the state of Israel was established, JR, his wife Beatrice, and his brother Ezra went to visit the Mushin family in Haifa. The family toured with them around the country, including, of course, the Hula Valley, where they saw the lake and the swamp. And you can just imagine, ding, ding, ding. He's thinking, I drain these things at home. So JR, coming from a land of plenty and visiting a new country that at the time, and perhaps some would say still today, is struggling to provide basic foodstuffs and jobs to its citizens, including hundreds of thousands of refugees who were returning en masse to their homeland. And he had an idea, and although it had been brought up before, of course, long before, he realized that he could do it. There would be new farmland, jobs would be created, and he made a proposal to the Israeli government. His company would drain the valley at cost, importing the heavy machinery that would do the work, and then he would leave it as a gift to the government for future drainage maintenance. He met with Golda Meir, who at the time was Minister of Labor, and the proposal was accepted. A contract was signed in 1952. JR is second from the left with glasses, signing with the black suit coat. And the company, which was now known as Construction Aggregates Corporation, or CAC, was obligated to dig a number of primary canals in the valley for a total distance of 27.5 kilometers, something around 17 miles, as well as other secondary canals. And the entire project had to be finished within 28 months. One source claims that JR asked Golda to leave a small area of the swamp undrained in order to preserve its special character. And of course, it should be noted that back then, the ecological importance of wetlands was not a widely held view at the time. Even the founders of the SPNI, the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel, who lobbied successfully for the government to leave an area of the swamp undrained, agreed that the project should go ahead and that most of it should be drained. They just wanted to preserve an area of wetlands that would allow for the continued survival of many species that would suffer from the drainage project. And that area of the wetlands still exists and is known today as the Hula Nature Reserve, not quite as popular as the nearby reflooded Agamon, which is managed by the JNF. But now we go back to our original question. How can cranes remove the muck underneath the lake and the swamp without sinking? This may have been a new question in Israel, but JR had been dealing with it for years. He brought over 2 huge cranes that were fitted on barges. These were known as hopper dredges. Hopper, because they would go from one side, let's say in the United States, and pull up sand, put it on the boat, hop over to the other side, and release it. So he brought in that, and he brought in other equipment. Everything was assembled in Israel after arriving in pieces from overseas. The CAC engineers made scores of underwater test drillings in order to plan the project efficiently, and the JNF built a small dam known as the Cork, Hupkuk, at the southern tip of the valley, so that the water level would always be high enough to allow the hopper dredges to do their work while floating. Now, that's counterintuitive. You would think that the last thing you would want to do is make a dam, because you want all the water to go out. But in order to deepen and to dig underwater canals, you have to have enough water in order for these things to float, because they can't go around when it's just a little bit wet. They would simply sink. So that's why they built the dam. And years later, this cork would be removed in a ceremony with much fanfare, as you can see here. Today, there's still a bridge right there across the Jordan River, which many people still call the Cork Bridge, Gesher Hupkuk. It has a number of names. So the hoppers not only dredged the wetlands of Muck, but they were also fitted with special equipment that could chop the huge amounts of reed and papyrus plants. Because as opposed to sand, which is much easier to pull up and send out, here you have an incredible amount of plants that will clog it. So before it was sucked out and sent on, it actually had to be chopped up. So that muck, which was mainly made out of peat, and the plants, and a lot of water to dilute it, were removed and transported in pipes to an area outside of the wetlands. The main eastern canal was dug to a depth of 3 to 5 meters. Here, the mud was sent in pipes further down the canal in order to build higher banks. You can see here banks of peat that could sustain future floodwaters, which the Jordan River couldn't handle itself. In May of 1955, the CAC finished its work. All the equipment, including the hopper dredges, were given, according to the agreement, to the JNF for future maintenance. JR left it as a gift to Israel. The world's greatest earth mover was also one of the world's greatest lovers of Israel. In 1963, JR was given an honorary doctorate of technical sciences at the Technion in Haifa. Here are some excerpts from a speech given in his honor by that legendary Minister of Finance, Pinchas Sapir. And he said, "When I first met Mr. Sensibar in 1950, the first thing he told me was, you can do so many important things in Israel, but first of all, please drain the Hula, because when you finish this project, you'll be granted new life, health, new villages, and fields of crops." That's what he told me. The Hula was Genesis land, Eretz Breshit, full of rich flora, great as a nature reserve, but terrible as a barrier to farming and industry. And some of our brave pioneers tried to go to the valley and live there, but the thought of turning the entire swamp into an oasis of life at the time was considered a dream and a faraway vision. But for the likes of someone like Mr. Sensibar, it was a very realistic possibility. He not only suggested what to do about it, but he went about making it happen. And it's because of him that the Hula has changed into a fertile site with thriving villages that offer new life and comfortable living. And so, thanks to Mr. Sensibar's inspiration, his initiative, and his leadership, the entire region has changed for the better. That was part of the speech given by Pinchas Sapir. JR afterwards went on to be instrumental in another huge project, turning the Dead Sea into a source of minerals that helped the Israeli economy gain millions of dollars, literally, in revenue. He did much work on behalf of the UJA. He was national president of Friends of the Technion in the USA that helped raise millions of dollars for this prestigious university. He helped, with his connections to Golda Meir, arrange a visit in 1952 to Israel by Helen Keller. And he was involved in countless other chesed projects throughout his life, which unfortunately came to an end in 1968 when he was 78 years old. One final word about the Hula Valley and the Dead Sea projects. It is, of course, somewhat ironic that these two projects, the draining of the Hula Valley and the establishment of the Dead Sea Works to produce precious metals and minerals, raise many eyebrows today among environmentalists. The draining, as it turned out, presented as many problems as it solved, and challenges to Israel over the years, still today. The Kinneret became full of dangerous nitrates. There were some species from the pre-drained valley that are extinct, and today parts of the valley, of course, as we all know and we saw, have been reflooded. Also, the Dead Sea is receding rapidly and dangerously, and about 1/3 of the water recession there is due to the Dead Sea Works. But I believe this is all hindsight. This is wisdom after the fact. At the time, these were the urgent needs of Israel. This is what the consensus was at the time. And without J.R. Sensibar, there is doubt that these challenges could be met with his efficiency, his vision, and his generosity. I have searched the grounds of the JNF-run Agamona Hula, which is wonderful. It's full of plaques and explanatory signs. I have yet to see any mention of J.R. Sensibar's name. A new, beautiful, high-tech, state-of-the-art visitor center has just recently been dedicated at the Agamon, with films and models and multimedia screens that explain how the Hula Valley was drained. Little floating hopper dredges pop out on a miniature model of the wetlands to show how the deed was done. I didn't hear any mention of Mr. Sensibar. A new book was put out by the JNF last year that tells the story of the Hula Valley with beautiful explanations and pictures. I couldn't find one word about Mr. Sensibar there. So perhaps it's time for us, we're starting here at Leave Note, but hopefully this will start a wave to give credit where credit is due. Abraham, Moses, and Isaiah were biblical visionaries. Herzl was a visionary for the future state of Israel. Rav Kook and Rabbi A.J. Heschel were spiritual visionaries. Jacob Raphael Sensibar, even though his home was in faraway Chicago, was a visionary for the building, development, and economy of Israel. But he wasn't just a visionary. He was a doer. He proved that the world's greatest earth mover could indeed move mountains. As you know, we connect at Leave Node every site with a Jewish value. And I would like to connect the Hula Valley and J.R. Sensibar story to the Jewish value of loving the land of Israel. Now, where does it say that that's a Jewish value? Well, I'm not making it up. There are a number of sources, but I'll use just one. In the book of Psalms, in Psalm 102, it says, you will surely, talking about God, God, you will surely arise and have mercy on Zion, for it is time to be gracious to her. The appointed time has come. Your servants take delight in her stones and cherish her dust. I want to repeat that because it's a very powerful line. Your servants will take delight in her stones and cherish her dust of the land of Israel. Many scholars see this verse as one of the biblical sources for the Jewish value of loving the land of Israel. And this is also the source for those who have a tradition to kiss the land of Israel when arriving. Jacob Raphael Sensibar not only understood the stories and dust of the land of Israel, but I believe he delighted in them too. I hope that this is just the beginning of more research that will be done to tell the story of those whose stories haven't yet been told. And J.R. Sensibar's is just one. He has family in Israel and in Chicago and in the United States that have been very helpful. And hopefully we'll find more things that will happen. Hopefully other organizations and other sources and other guides and other books and people will give credit to a very special man. So I thank his family for helping. And also, of course, I thank Leave Node for allowing this research to be done. And within that framework, thanking again Mayor Paltiel for his years of service and welcoming, of course, others into the Leave Node family instead. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all of them, but I can try. And if not, then we can hope that we can all stay healthy and happy in the coming days before that vaccine comes or those skies open up.
Michael, I've heard before that the Anopheles mosquito and malaria were not such threats in the early 1950s. What made it stop being a problem?
How did they stop it?
No, why was malaria becoming less of a problem in the early 1950s? Was it because of DDT?
Yes, specifically DDT. I mean, of course, already in the 40s, quinine was already known to be a solution, but that was given to people who were already sick. But by the 50s, all over the world, in India, that little poster I'd shown is actually from India, that they were spraying DDT and the numbers already went down. But, you know, it was like they were in a schwung, you know, and you couldn't stop it. I know it's not like today it wouldn't work, you know, like we're much more cynical. We would say, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. That's not good enough of a reason. But back then, I think people wanted to be part of it. And it's just so easy today to go back and say, you know, what were they thinking? They were thinking that this was a great thing for the state of Israel. And I'm guessing that things that we think that are great things for the state of Israel may one day turn out to be not so great, and things that we think aren't so great may turn out to be great. But that's all hindsight. And at the time, we have to take all of our, you know, wisdom of everybody and the appointed officials and public and journalism and spirituality and prayer and put everything together and try to make the best decisions. So I you know, obviously as someone who loves the environment and nature, it hurts, you know, to see that there's species not there, but I don't really feel upset or feel that there's a need to blame the people back then, because from what I read, they, even though they knew that some of these things weren't so important anymore, I think they were trying to do something that was part of a concept. And the concept in general was a good one. for building a nation. Now we're in a different stage. So
Michael?
yeah, like DDT, right? That was a great thing. People thought DDT is the best thing in the world, and now we know DDT is not so. There's a lot of problems with it, besides the fact that they used to spray people with it. But there's, it's not just a simple thing. Yes, Philip, please.
Have you shared your story with anybody at Kakal? And what if
No,
so?
not yet. Not yet. Not at all.
That's your task.
Yes, definitely. I want to in a very nice way, obviously not upset because, there could be things that I don't know about. I sent the article to the family to get their reactions, and I will approach the folks at JNF, and I think they'll be happy.
Is there a written article?
No, well, I just started this. This is just the beginning, and because at Leave Note we're doing a book on sites in the north that have Jewish values. And so these classes that I'm giving will actually turn into, hopefully, a guidebook on that subject. And of course, before that happens, I want to give the possibility for the JNF to be able to say, well, wait, you didn't know there's a plaque here, or we'll work on it now, or whatever. I definitely don't want to condemn them or anything. Just I haven't yet talked to them because I still ask the family to give me their reactions, and then I will approach someone. If anybody knows anyone there who deals with this stuff, so I'd be happy to know. But in general, just a generic letter to their to the folks in charge. I think they'd be very happy to pick up the handkerchief, as we say. Yes.
Quick question.
Yes, Jackie.
Anybody of the Sensibar family, the next generation, still involved with any projects here?
The next generation was, but they sold the company. So they're not now dealing with it. And they've all gone in different directions.
Okay.
So it's still happening with the same name,
sure.
but but that family isn't involved in it anymore.
Right. Agav, I'll send you something separately. I have a contact at JNF that maybe be able to be some use.
Yofi, I'd be happy. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yofi.
Thank you.
Oh,
I can't believe
Shavuot Tov.
Never heard of this guy before. Amazing.
I'm sure there's many more folks like that.
Yeah.
So,
Michael, as someone who's familiar with Chicago, has nothing to do with your talk. One day you should look up how O'Hare Airport got named after who was O'Hare.
I know who O'Hare was.
Who
Quite
was
a
O'Hare?
Story.
Not a rabbit.
Was a World War II pilot and war hero who shot down in like 30 minutes 5 Japanese aircraft and saved his aircraft carrier. Butch O'Hare.
Whoa.
He was the son of a huge criminal.
Right. Also, of the mafia, an Irish mafia.
Probably. Go
What,
ahead.
like a mafia?
Go ahead. Sal, go ahead.
No,
You mean a mafia type criminal?
mafia,
Yes.
like mamash.
Yes. And he decided to turn his life around, and he became a war hero.
Wow. That
He
is a
didn't
great
survive the war.
story.
He didn't survive the war. He got shot
It's
down.
like that book that they wrote about Jewish criminals, but at least they love their mothers. That's a great title. Yeah, fair. We can always do tshuva. Maybe it's a good tshuva story.
Michael.
Yes.
Look, somebody came to say hello.
Shalom, Aslomech.
I have, I really enjoyed this evening because I have a very profound connection with Gary, Indiana.
Really?
Yes.
What?
My mother's sister and her family lived there.
Still today?
We were there like almost twice a month in the years that I lived there.
Wow, yeah. Fair.
It's not a nice town, or it wasn't.
No, everything I read about it was not too pleasant, like crime rate, but they made a lot of steel, so
Yes,
that was good.
Yes, I did.
Wow, yeah, fair. So we can run off with this and keep doing research, hopefully. So
Okay.
Shavua Tov to everybody. Stay healthy, and Todah Shmuel Cohen for all your help.
Todah Shmuel.
I'll be happy.
Okay.
Laila Tov.
Bye-bye.